Throughout human history, people have woven traditional stories about the founding of different notable places. Many of these stories have been forgotten, and only a few of them have survived the test of time and were written down and thus preserved for the future generations. There are few places in the world which can boast of having an attested inscription of their foundation. These rare records serve as unique birth certificates that were cast in stone. There are even fewer places throughout the world which have traditional stories along with memorial inscriptions which mark their foundation. Yerevan is one of the rare places which has both. Legends about an all-destructive world deluge have survived throughout all of the populated continents. The most renowned of these is the one recorded in the Holy Bible, which tells us that the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days, and the ark rested upon the mountains of Ararat. The Armenian people who inhabited the plains around Mountain Ararat preserved an ancient account about the naming of the city of Yerevan in the foothills of the sacred mountain. According to the traditional account, after the Great Flood, when the Ark of Salvation landed upon the peak of Mount Ararat, Noah from the top of the mountain saw land and exclaimed, "It appears." And since the visible land was the place of the future, Yerevan, the city, was named Yerevan, which in Armenian literally means apparent. The traditional legend about the naming of Yerevan is about the Armenian oral account about the world's great flood. This traditional account was written down by ancient Armenian authors, medieval European travelers, and classical historians. The earliest surviving written account comes from the 1st century BC work of Nicolaus of Damascus. The investigation of that work reveals that the Armenian narrative of the Great Flood already existed in the pre-Christian period, and probably was first written down as early as the period of cuneiform writing. How old is this narrative? Was it originally part of the narrative of the Great Flood, or was it added later on? This question remains a matter of academic debate. Early hominids inhabited the vicinity of Yerevan around 2 million years ago, in what is known in archaeology as the early Acheulean period. The caves of Yerevan presented a satisfactory climate for the evolutionary processes of early pre-humans. Armenia's biotope was favorable enough for habitation of early humans during a time when humans had not developed civilization. and thus lacked the advanced tools, the domesticated animals, and other means that were common to early civilization. During this time, early humans looked for shelters in order to hide and protect themselves at nights from various predators. Throughout this period, early humans used caves and did not alter the natural construction of these dwellings and did not furnish the interior. Traces of early human inhabitation in and around Yerevan has a history of tens of thousands of years. During this period, early humans dwelt in caves and used stone and flint tools. The use of fire was mastered by humans early on, and it became a powerful weapon against the forces of nature. Fire was a source of warmth and means for cooking food. It also helped to drive away wild beasts. People secured their food by hunting, fishing, and gathering various edible fruits and vegetables. The caves of Yerevan were extensively examined in the 20th century and were identified as lava bubble formations, which served as shelters for pre-humans and early humans. The wealth of artifacts that has been unearthed from these caves connotes the fact that they were inhabited for quite a long time. This is especially true for Yerevan 1, Yerevan 2, and other caves. The traces of Homo sapiens found in the caves of Yerevan are dated to the Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age period. The vicinity of Yerevan is not only important due to its prehistoric traces, but also due to the fact that it is one of the world's earliest sites of civilization. This era corresponds to the early Bronze Age of Armenian Highland, which encompasses a period of about 1,000 years from the middle of the 4th millennium to the middle of the 3rd millennium BC. The Shengavit archaeological site, located on the shores of Yerevan Lake, was an important center of this culture. This is why a number of scholars have named the early Bronze Age culture of Armenia Shengavitian. Yerevan's early civic life can be traced to the middle of the 4th millennium BC and begun in the vicinity of Shengavit. The Shengavit settlement at its height had a population of several thousand. This is revealed by the archaeological evidence, which showed that in the radius of about 15 acres of land, there were at least 900 to 1,000 dwellings. It has been estimated that each dwelling housed anywhere from 5 to 8 inhabitants. If we multiply this number by the amount of dwellings, we reach a rough estimate of 5,000 inhabitants, which fully conforms to the definition of an early city of the ancient Near East. When we examine all of the components that are associated with the culture of Shengavit, we cannot but conclude that it was an advanced city for the given time period. The Shengavitian houses are fascinating. They were circular with an adjoining square-shaped structure. The hearth was placed in the center of the home and was embellished with the heads of sacred animals. The hearth fulfilled both a religious and practical function. It served as a heating system and cooked the food. The houses had rounded ceilings which had an opening that served as the entry point of sunlight and also let the smoke out of the house. The ceilings of Shengavit houses were patterned in the Hazarajani style, which survived as a traditional element of Armenian agriculture for the subsequent millennia all the way to the present. The early Bronze Age pottery contained hieroglyphic inscriptions, which was a manifestation of early Armenian writing form.
Երբ մենք իմի ենք բերում Շենգավթի բոլոր
This is attested by elements which include monumental architecture, the density of construction, the size of the population made up of thousands of inhabitants, the elaborate social system of elites, and the symbols associated with their power, most notably ceremonial scepters and gold decorations, a complex religious system, abundance of copper artifacts, international trade, an established class of skilled craftsmen, and additional factors. All of these elements, without a doubt, connote that Shengavit was an ancient Near Eastern city and was the political, religious, and socio-economic center of a vast region around which had banded numerous other satellite settlements that were also part of the Shengavitian culture. Other Bronze Age settlements in the vicinity of Yerevan have been discovered in Avan, Norabat, Khosrovapatil, Noragyuh, and Verin Judashen district, approximately 2 miles east of the Erebuni fortress. Important artifacts were also unearthed from archaeological sites in and around Yerevan from the Middle and Late Bronze Ages, as well as from the early Iron Age. The most notable of these is in Tsitsernakaberd, a site that was continuously inhabited from the Bronze Age until the late Middle Ages. According to the folk legends, this site was associated with the worship of the goddess Astgik, who used swallows as messengers to invite those she had chosen as her lovers. This is from where Tsitsernakaberd, which in Armenian means the fortress of the swallows, took its name. Exquisitely made artifacts also have been found in Zoraberd, the pre-Eurasian layer of Karmir Balur, and from various tombs that were accidentally unearthed during construction works throughout Yerevan. The written history of the city was recorded relatively late. Yerevan was mentioned for the first time in a cuneiform inscription dating from the first quarter of the first millennium BC. Today, we still do not know which one of the early 3rd to 2nd millennium BC Armenian state formations Yerevan formed part of. As was noted, the first written inscriptions about the area encompassing the Ararat Valley during the reigns of kings Ishpuini and Menua of the Kingdom of Van. The period of the Kingdom of Van, or Ararat Urartu, is of utmost importance to the history of Yerevan between the 9th and 7th centuries BC. This kingdom reached the zenith of its power and, by consolidating its rule, became the first all-Armenian kingdom, which united all of Armenian highland, and through further conquests expanded beyond the borders of the great Armenian plateau. These conquests made the kingdom of Ararat into one of the superpowers of the ancient world. The consolidation of all of Armenian Highland by the kings of Van Tushpa began in the 9th and were completed in the 8th century BC. In the 5th year of his reign, in 782 BC, the king of Van Argishti I, in order to secure his northern flank, launched a military expedition from the Ararat Valley and reached as far as the Agstev Valley. The military expedition was an overwhelming success. In order to consolidate his gains and strengthen his positions in the north, the king ordered the erection of a fortress, which he named Erebuni. In the memorial inscription which was made in honor of the founding of the fortress, the king made it clear that he erected the fortress for the purpose of strengthening his country and in order to instill fear into his enemies. The inscription reads, "With the greatness of Haldi Argishti, son of Menua, built this great fortress and named it Erebuni in order to strengthen the land of Biainili and instill fear into its enemies. Argishti proclaims that this land was barren. I carried out great works here. With the greatness of Haldi Argishti, son of Menua, is a mighty and great king, the sovereign of the land of Biainili, the lord of the city of Tushpa." The king invested large sums in order to build the fortress of Erebuni. The fortress was one of the most magnificent ones of its period, and the archaeological digs from the site have revealed a wealth of artifacts. The archaeological finds help us to reconstruct a more complete picture of how the fortress looked like during its heyday. When entering through the main gate, the visitor comes face to face with the Great Square. To the left of the square stands the Temple of Haldi. Decorative bronze shields were encased upon the exterior walls of the temple. And the interior was adorned with beautiful frescoes. Facing the Temple of Haldi was the Great Palace Hall. Upon the pediments of the palace's columns were cuneiform inscriptions about the temple's foundation. The hall was adorned with columns. Its walls were embellished with exquisite frescoes, which depicted religious as well as secular motifs. In the center of the hall stood the throne, which seated the viceroy, and in the event of a visit by the sovereign, the king himself, the throne was placed upon a pedestal to give it a measure of elevation. The other fortress temple was called Susi. To the right and left of its entrance were memorial inscriptions about its foundation. The surviving portions of the temple reveal the outer walls were painted in blue, and the interior walls surrounding the temple's yard were painted in red and were also embellished with encasted bronze shields. The preliminary examination of the Erebuni archaeological site was conducted in 1950, and systematic excavations begun in 1952 and continued all the way to the present. During the excavations, numerous cuneiform inscriptions were found, which recorded the foundation of the fortress and the subsequent construction of the fortress's temple, military barracks, warehouses, and other buildings. The digs revealed numerous buildings along with countless artifacts, which help us better understand the everyday life of its inhabitants. Many of the artifacts are fantastic in their execution, even by today's standards. Some of the artifacts were made in order to commemorate the founding of the fortress. Most notably, this includes the inscribed shields. Unfortunately, we do not know why Argishti chose the name Erebuni for the fortress. A number of scholars have proposed different theories. Margot Israelian was the first to point out the connection between the names Erebuni and Yerevan. Israelian believed that the name Erebuni originally stemmed from the word for victory. There have been other etymological propositions also. One of these suggested that the name Erebuni meant the color of blood, since the hill which the fortress is situated on it is called Arinberd, and Ariyun is the Armenian word for blood. Another explanation based on the name Arinberd has suggested that perhaps Erebuni meant the place of the people of Ari or Eri. Several other explanations of the name have also been made, including Joyous City, Visible City, Home of Ara, Eagle City, Free City, Stronghold, Sun City, and a number of others. For approximately a century, the fortress of Erebuni served as the main northern stronghold of the Kingdom of Van. In around 680 to 670 BC, that function was passed to the fortress of Teishe-Baini, which was erected by King Rusa II. The fortress of Teishe-Baini is located at the archaeological site of Karmir-Belur, which is also within the boundaries of the city of Yerevan. The fortress of Teishe-Baini was built on the left bank of the Hrazdan River, not far from Shengavi, and was named in honor of the second most important deity of the kingdom of Ararat, Teishiba, the god of war and courage. Systematic excavations of Teishe-Baini begun in 1939 and have continued all the way to the present. The archaeological finds at this site help us to piece together a more complete picture of how the fortress originally looked like. The fortress was surrounded by about a 10-foot wide and 25-foot tall wall. The foundations of the wall and most of the buildings were made out of stone, on top of which were erected clay brick walls. These bricks were often painted due to religious or aesthetic purposes. The two-story citadel was a monumental structure that included an extensive yard, which contained temples, palatial luxury rooms, workshops, grain storage rooms, numerous warehouses, wine cellars, and other buildings. The wine cellars are especially impressive. Each of them included about 70 to 80 huge storage pots that were able to hold about 1,000 liters of wine. The huge pots were inscribed with cuneiform and hieroglyphic inscriptions which indicated their capacity. The fortress of Teishe-Baini has yielded many cuneiform and hieroglyphic inscriptions that were inscribed on stone, clay tablets, metallic items, and seals that were made out of various materials. The weapons in particular are super bly made. They include shields, quivers, helmets, and arrowheads, which are exquisite works of art. The amount of finely made agricultural tools is also abundant, which also testifies about the high level of craftsmanship and art of the period. The gold and silver jewelry is in a category of its own and includes some of the finest masterpieces in the history of world art. Interestingly enough, DNA remains unearthed from the Teshibani tombs closely match with the DNA of modern Armenians. This comes to attest that there has been a major population change, and the natives of Armenian highland have continuously inhabited this area from this period all the way to the present. King Rusa II built an elaborate canal. The erection of the canal was recorded by the king at the archaeological site of Zvartnots. Thanks to the irrigation system created by the construction of the canal, the king was able to establish gardens, which are unique in world history, since they still survive and are almost 3,000 years old. These gardens should have been turned into tourist attraction sites for travelers from all across the world, but unfortunately, they have been neglected and mismanaged by successive administrations during the Soviet and post-Soviet periods. Only about 1,300 acres were saved. Besides Erebuni and Teshibani, a number of other monumental structures from the period of Ararat-Urartu Kingdom have been found throughout the territory of Yerevan. These are, for most part, tombs, which gives us a better understanding of the religious beliefs of the afterlife that were practiced by our ancestors. The kingdom of Van, or Ararat-Urartu, was succeeded by the Haykazun-Yervanduni state. The Haykazun-Yervanduni dynasty ruled Armenia the longest and held power until 201 BC. During this time, they successfully checked the attempts of neighboring Media at absorbing their state into their realm, and afterwards allied themselves with Achaemenids. Although from the 6th to the 4th centuries BC, the Yervandunis held a semi-independent status within the Achaemenid Empire, they nevertheless were able to preserve the might of their state, which in 330 BC successfully resisted the attempts of Alexander the Great of conquering Armenia. The Haykazun-Yervandunis carried out numerous important works which were recorded in Armenian and non-Armenian sources. Erebuni Yerevan during this period continued to play an important role. A number of architectural modifications were made to the fortress. In the 6th, 5th centuries BC, the Temple of Haldi was remolded and was turned into a columned hall, or an apadana. A new shrine with the eternal flame was also built inside the fortress. The silver rhytons dating to the 6th, 5th centuries BC that were found in Erebuni were exceptional works of art. No doubt they belonged to wealthy and influential owners. It was also during this time that metal currency began its circulation throughout Armenia. Like their Greek counterparts, which are the world's oldest coins, these coins also lack inscriptions. The obverse side of the coin depicts a lion's head, while the reverse side shows an equilateral cross, which symbolizes the sun. It is particularly interesting that the coins found in Erebuni were excavated from the area of the temple's altar. Interesting monuments from this period include the Kavakart monument, found near Karmir Belur, the Avan Memorial, and others.
Երևանյան հարստությունից հետո Երևանը պահպանում է իր դերն ու նշանակությունը.
After the fall of the Yerevanduni dynasty, Yerevan continued to maintain its role and importance in the Hellenistic period. A noteworthy monument of this period is represented by the settlement of Avan Arinch on the banks of the Getar River, which unfortunately has been completely ruined due to modern-day construction. Tombs from the Hellenistic period have been found throughout Yerevan, which affirm that virtually all of the territory of present-day Yerevan during this period was already populated. In the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, the kingdom of Greater Armenia was ruled by the Artaxerxean dynasty, which is also stemmed from the Haikazuni dynasty. The greatest sovereign of the Artaxerxean dynasty, who throughout Armenian history conquered the most territory, was Tigran the Great. As a result of his victorious military campaigns, Tigran the Great created an Armenian empire, which encompassed a territory of approximately 3 million square kilometers. This empire was 10 times larger than the territory of Greater Armenia. Prior to and during the reign of Tigran the Great, a number of new cities and fortresses were built throughout Armenia. New roads and bridges were also erected. Archaeological artifacts dating from this period have been found in the territory of Yerevan, from the sites of Kozrovopat, Karmir, Balur, Kond, and Avan. The archaeological finds from Avan have yielded numerous important artifacts, dating from the 2nd century BC to the 1st century AD. These include silver coins of Alexander the Great and Parthian kings. These artifacts were saved, but unfortunately, the Avan site was lost due to unregulated construction. This took place during the Soviet period in the 1980s and continued in post-Soviet era, when the territory which included the archaeological site was sold off as private property. In the first half of the 1st century AD, Armenia found itself in a predicament. The kingdom of Great Armenia continued to exist. However, the Artaxerxean dynasty had fallen. According to the contemporary authors of this period, after Rome and Parthia, Armenia was the 3rd most powerful state of the ancient Near East. Both Rome and Parthia vied for control of the throne of Armenia, which led to warfare between these two states. After a prolonged struggle, the Artaxerxean dynasty was succeeded by the Arshakuni dynasty, which held the Armenian throne until 428 AD. It was during the rule of this dynasty that Armenia in 301 AD officially adopted Christianity and became the first Christian state. During this time, the settlements in the vicinity of present-day Yerevan continued to expand. This is attested by the materials that were found in Avan and Kond. Among the artifacts that were found from these sites were Parthian coins dating to the 1st century AD, as well as Sasanian and Roman coins dating to the 3rd to 5th centuries AD. Yerevan is mentioned in the earliest 5th century Armenian manuscripts, written in the Mashtotzian alphabet. The town is noted in the events surrounding the lives of Moses, Horenatsi, and David, the Invisible. The text states that after the fall of the Arshakuni dynasty, persecutions against various Armenian luminaries began, and Moses, Horenatsi, and his friends found refuge in Yerevan. Another early written account of Yerevan is recorded in a manuscript from 607, which notes that a national religious council was held by Catholicos Abraham in Yerevan. The national religious councils after the fall of independence were significant because they were tantamount to a legislative council that regulated the internal life of the nation. The Council of 607 was also significant due to the fact that two senior church fathers from Yerevan, David of Yerevan and Hunanis of Avan, took part in the assembly. An important account from the middle of the 7th century mentions the fortress of Yerevan and its heroic defense. In the 640s, the fortress was such a notable stronghold that it was able to withstand the onslaught of the Arab invaders, who have devastated much of Armenia and neighboring lands, but were not able to conquer the fortress of Yerevan. The fortress of Yerevan repelled another Arab attack in the 660s. The memory of the noble defense of the fortress survived for the centuries that followed. The 10th century Armenian historians Hovannis Draskanakertsi and Samuel Anetsi dubbed the heroic defense of the fortress as the Battle of Yerevan. In the last quarter of the 9th century, the Bagratuni dynasty restored Armenian independence. The 4.5 centuries of the national liberation struggle, which began after the fall of the Kingdom of Armenia in the 5th century, finally yielded results, and in 885, Ashat Bagratuni rose on the Armenian throne as the sovereign of a restored kingdom. His state received international recognition as both the Arab Caliphate and the Byzantine Empire sent crowns in recognition of the Armenian king. The Bagratuni dynasty, as well as a number of other Armenian offshoot kingdoms from the 9th to the 12th centuries, created new Armenian Christian cultural values, which are globally recognized for their universal significance. During the reign of the Bagratuni dynasty, Yerevan was noted as a full-fledged city in the 13th century. However, taking into consideration the reality of the feudal period, without a doubt, this process began during the Bagratuni period in the 9th to the 11th centuries, when the role of Yerevan had greatly increased. Yerevan became the hub of the most important noble families of the Bagratuni era. In addition, Yerevan during this time also possessed two very important Christian relics. One of these relics was a piece of the True Cross, which was mentioned during the reign of King Gagik, the first in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, and the other relic featured a portrait of Jesus Christ. The growth of Yerevan was also due to its geographical location. The international trade routes going through the city greatly stimulated the economy. This is attested by various international coins that were found from the territory of the city. Yerevan was located on the arterial northern route of the Great Silk Road, which began in northern Iran and through the Arax Valley reached the Black Sea. International trade routes stretching from east to west and south to north crossed through Yerevan. One could find in Yerevan markets goods from China, India, the Near East, Europe, and Africa. Yerevan in the 12th and 13th centuries turned into a thriving city, and as such, naturally developed an elaborate defense system. On the right and left banks of the Harazdan River were erected two fortresses. One of these was the fortress of Yerevan, and the other one was the fortress of Tsitsernakabel. In the 11th century, the Seljuk Turk invasion of Armenia was a serious setback for the country. Northeastern parts of Armenia, including Yerevan, were liberated from the Seljuks by the Armenian Zakarian princess in the beginning of the 13th century. Under the Zakarian rule, Yerevan was mentioned as a prosperous city, which was ruled by a local council of Armenian nobles. Unfortunately, the Zakarians were able to hold on to liberated northeastern Armenia for about 4 decades. Mongol invaders arrived from the east, and between 1230 to 1240 conquered Armenia. It is noteworthy that Yerevan continued to develop during the Mongol rule, and even turned into a coin minting center. In the first half of the 14th century, Mongol rulers Abu Zayd and Anushrivan issued in Yerevan coins, which included the name of Yerevan. An Armenian manuscript from 1336 noted Yerevan as an honorable city, which is a testament of its development and strength. The invasions of Timur are considered in world history as the most devastating. In 1387, Timur's hordes also attacked Yerevan. According to the chronicles of the time, 500 defenders of Yerevan gave their life for the defense of the city. In the 15th century, the Turkmen Karakoyunlu Confederacy established its rule in Armenia. The Karakoyunlu adopted a favorable disposition towards the Armenians. It was during this time, in 1441, that the seat of the Holy See of the Church of Armenia returned from Sis to Vargashapat. The Karakoyunlu set up the Ararat Governorate, which as its center had the city of Yerevan. From henceforth, Yerevan was often mentioned as the capital of the Araratian land. In the village of Argavand, which lies on the outskirts of Yerevan, a Turkmen Ak-Koyunlu tomb dated to 1413 is still standing to this day. The 16th and 17th centuries were a devastating time for the Armenian people. Armenia had turned into a theater of war for the feuding Ottoman Turkish and Iranian Safavid rulers. The destruction and displacement of the native Armenian population became a common phenomena. Ottoman Turkish historian Ibrahim Pechevi noted, "The Ottoman army moved toward Yerevan city, which was the soul of the Persians. It had amazing and beautiful palaces, gardens, and parks. Most of all, a heavenly park called the Sultan's Garden. All of this was put to the torch and was burned to the ground." According to the Ottoman Turkish historians, the two most important stronghold castle cities of the Near East were Baghdad and Yerevan. Thus, as we can see, the role of Yerevan in the 16th century had greatly risen. Based on the contemporary accounts, the population of Greater Yerevan, which included the outlying villages, was around 55 to 60,000 inhabitants. Of these, about 25 to 30,000 resided inside the city. A 1579 account notes that the Ottoman Turkish army captured approximately 60,000 Armenian inhabitants of Yerevan. Another massive disaster took place in 1604, when the Iranian Safavid Shah Abbas I forced some 300,000 Armenians to move to Iran. A considerable number of those Armenians who were forcibly moved to Iran were from Yerevan. As a result of the devastating Turkish-Iranian wars, Armenia was divided between the Ottoman Empire and Safavid Iran, with Eastern Armenia going to Iran and Western Armenia being occupied by the Ottoman Empire. This division continued until the early 19th century. Yerevan was the main center played by Yerevan is also known by the most important stronghold of Iran, minted in the northwest, and as such, the Iranian Shahs established the Khanate of Yerevan. Armenia, even under foreign occupation, continued to play an important role as a geographic and administrative unit. As was noted, this was reflected in the coins that were issued in Yerevan by various successive foreign rulers. The first of these were the Sasanians of Iran, followed by the Arabs, the Ilkhanat, the Akkuyunlu, and the Karakuyunlu. From the 16th to the 19th century, Eastern Armenia remained under Iranian rule. And during this period, 4 subsequent Iranian dynasties issued local coins, which stated that they were minted in the city of Yerevan. The first of these were the Safavids, who had 66 mints throughout Iran, followed by the Afshari dynasty, which had 34 mints, and finally the Zan dynasty, which had a total of 21 mints throughout Iran. All of these dynasties had a permanent mint in Yerevan. Even after the devastating Ottoman-Iranian wars, Yerevan was able to quickly recover. In 1608, only 4 years after Shah Abbas, the first devastation of Yerevan, Antonio de Govea, the envoy of King Philip III of Spain, and Safavid Iran noted, "Yerevan is the most important city of all of Greater Armenia and is its capital. It is inhabited exclusively by Armenians. The soil is arable and is fertile and rich with all kinds of food." Similar testimony is given in the 1630s by the French traveler Jean-Baptiste Tavernier. 2 of Tavernier's illustrations from this book, 6 Voyages of Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, depict Yerevan. Another engraving of Yerevan was done by the French traveler Jean Chardin, who visited the city in 1673. Chardin called Yerevan the capital of Armenia. He recorded an interesting oral account that was told by the local residents. According to Armenians, Yerevan is the oldest dwelling in the world, since the locals say it was here that Patriarch Noah and his family had lived before the Great Flood and remained here after they descended from the mountain upon which the ark had rested. Furthermore, the Armenians say that the terrestrial paradise, the Garden of Eden, was also here. Chardin also noted that Yerevan had folk theater troupes, which toured the city and with accompanying music performed various plays. A number of scholars believe that this was a surviving tradition of the antique Armenian folk theater, known as sutsk. The Armenian shadow theater genre is perhaps a component of this folk culture. The earthquake of 1679 devastated much of Yerevan, destroying most of its buildings and killing thousands of Yerevan's inhabitants. As a result of the earthquake, the pagan temple of Garni, which remained standing from the 1st to the 17th century, was also destroyed. The temple was finally rebuilt in 1971. However, neither the Muslim invaders or natural disasters were able to break the spirit of the Armenian inhabitants of Yerevan. After each calamity, the city's residents quickly recovered and rebuilt their dwellings and religious shrines. The 5th century Church of Saints Peter and Paul was rebuilt right after the earthquake. The Soviet authorities completely destroyed this ancient church in the 1930s. In 1693, in the place of the Church of Apostle Anya, which was destroyed by the earthquake, the Church of the Invisible Holy Mother of God was erected. This church is still standing today. In the 1690s, the damaged churches of Katogike and Holy Mother of God that were erected next to each other were also rebuilt. The Holy Mother of God was built in the 7th century and was mostly destroyed by the Soviets during the 1930s. The 10th century Church of Katogike has survived. In 2015, next to Katogike, the Church of Saint Anna was erected. In 1710, in the district of Kond, on top of another ruined medieval church, was built the Church of St. John. This church was renovated in the 1980s. The Church of St. Sarkis was built between 1835 to 1842, was completely rebuilt in the 1970s. Heroic pages in the history of Yerevan were written in 1724 during the defense of the city against the invading Ottoman army. The fall of the Iranian Safavid dynasty in 1722 led to the invasion of Iran from the north by Russia and from the west by the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, two Armenian provinces, Artsakh and Syunik, began their struggle for national liberation. In 1724, the Ottoman Turkish army attacked Yerevan, and the Armenian defenders heroically stood in defense of their city. The Iranian Khan, who ruled the city after realizing he could not defend much of the city, withdrew to the city's citadel. Yerevan's residents were left alone in defending themselves against the encroaching enemy. The Armenians from the neighboring villages had joined the inhabitants of Yerevan and set up militia detachments, altogether numbering around 10,000. This militia was able to defend the city for 2 months against an Ottoman army numbering, by the contemporary accounts, as much as 60,000 troops. The Ottomans were able to conquer the city in September of that year, after suffering around 20,000 casualties. Thanks to the defense of the city, most of its inhabitants were not only able to save their lives, but also thwarted the advance of the Ottoman Turkish army against the Armenian regions of Syunik and Artsakh.
Պարսկական տիրապետության շրջանում Երևանում թողարկված դրամները եղել են.
During the Iranian rule, both gold and silver coins were minted in Yerevan. These were state coins that circulated throughout Iran. In addition, the local khans were allowed to mint their own bronze coins, which bore the name of Yerevan. The city of Yerevan, throughout the 400 years of Iranian rule, held an important administrative position. This legacy still survives in Iran, as some of the leading Iranian religious and secular leaders have the surname Iravani, which in Farsi means of Yerevan. This connotes that their ancestors once lived in Yerevan and held important administrative positions in the city, and that heritage still survives in their family names. Yerevan also played an important role as a medieval Armenian learning center. In their various religious establishments throughout the city, New manuscripts were being written and many older ones were being copied. The oldest surviving manuscript, which is associated with Yerevan, is a gospel written on a parchment and is dated to 1181. Yerevan's scholastic centers received a new impetus in the 15th century, when the city became the center of the land of Ararat, and the seat of the Armenian Church returned to Etchmiadzin. The preserved manuscripts that were written during this time are kept in Yerevan's Mesrop Mashtats Museum Institute of Ancient Manuscripts, more commonly known as the Matenadaran. The first 30 years of the 19th century were especially faithful for the subsequent history of Yerevan and all of Armenians. During this time, two major Russo-Persian wars were waged, as a result of which most of eastern Armenia was united to the Russian Empire. During both of these wars, a number of Armenian volunteers fought on the side of Russia under their own battle flags. Here are a few of the flags of the Armenian volunteer detachments. In 1804 and 1808, Russian troops twice laid siege to the fortress of Yerevan, yet were unable to break through. The fortress of Yerevan was finally taken on October 1, 1827, with the aid of the Armenian volunteers. In order to commemorate this important victory, a medal for the taking of Yerevan was issued and awarded to many soldiers who had taken part in the military campaign. The Russo-Persian War ended on February 10, 1828, with the conclusion of the Treaty of Turkmenchai. According to the treaty, the Hanatis of Yerevan and Nakhchivan, along with the country of Ordubad, became part of the Russian Empire. The treaty was signed by Prince Abbas Mirza on behalf of Persia and Commander Ivan Paskevich on behalf of Russia. The terms of the treaty were in part prepared by the renowned Russian writer and diplomat, Alexander Griboyedov. From the above-noted territories of eastern Armenia, the Armenian province of the Russian Empire was formed and Yerevan became its center. This administrative division lasted from 1828 to 1840. The Armenian province had its own coat of arms, which featured under the Russian double-headed eagle, the three main symbols of Armenia. Mount Ararat, with Noah's Ark at its summit, the crown of the most renowned Armenian king Tigran the Great, and the mother cathedral of Etchmiadzin, the spiritual center of Christian Armenia. In 1840, the Armenian province was dissolved, and the territory was added to the Georgian Imeretian province of the Russian Empire. This caused an outrage among many Armenians, and the Russian government was forced to once again change the administrative boundaries in 1849. The new administrative division established the province of Yerevan, with the city of Yerevan as its center. The province of Yerevan existed until 1918. It too had its own coat of arms. However, unlike the Armenian province, the symbols on the coat of arms of the Yerevan province were not associated with Armenian national symbols. The end of Islamic rule and the inclusion of Yerevan and eastern Armenia into the Russian Empire overall had a positive effect. Yerevan expanded and turned into a center of Armenian national life. A number of periodicals and books in the Armenian language appeared for the first time. New schools, theaters, and other cultural centers were also opened. Various branches of the economy also quickly developed. The largest of these industries was the brandy factory, which was established in 1887. New small-scale factories were also established. A hydroelectric plant was built. New hospitals were founded. An important element of public transport during the late 19th and early 20th century was the horse car.
Երևանը ռուսական կայսրության կազմում որոշակի
As a result of industrial output, most notably due to brandy production, Yerevan by the late 19th century had already shown impressive economic growth. In 1901, the railroad reached Yerevan and connected the city to the rest of the Russian Empire and beyond. This in turn created a new impetus for further growth of the economy. In 1897, the Russian Empire conducted its first census, which showed that Yerevan had a population of about 29,000 inhabitants.
որը ցույց տվեց, որ Երևանում բնակվում էր 29,000 մարդ։
The two Russian revolutions that took place in 1917 had a global impact. After the November 1917 revolution, Transcaucasus was de facto separated from Russia, and in January of 1918, the region was invaded by the Turkish army. After carrying out the Armenian genocide throughout western Armenia, the Turkish army was poised in doing the same in eastern Armenia and finishing off what had remained of the Armenian people. Had it not been for the unity and determination of Armenians who had gathered their forces in and around Yerevan, the Turkish army might have achieved its heinous objective. Aram Manoukian, the chairman of the Yerevan National Council, along with a number of gifted Armenian generals, led the defense of the city. The Armenians, during these battles, were able to thwart the advance of the murderous Turkish army, and thus not only survived, but laid the foundation for the restoration of the Armenian state. The Armenian National Council of Tiflis, which was the supreme elected body of Eastern Armenians, on May 28, 1918, proclaimed to the world Armenia's Declaration of Independence. Thus, after centuries of foreign domination, the Armenian state was restored. Most notably, the new Armenian state also had a new form of government. Unlike the previous Armenian states, the new state was not an absolute monarchy, but a parliamentary republic. The rebirth of the Armenian state also opened a new page in the history of Yerevan. The city was proclaimed as the capital of the free and independent Republic of Armenia. The re-emergence of Armenian independence was full of untold hardships. The unspeakable effects of the Armenian genocide and World War I had taken their toll. Hunger and epidemics were prevalent throughout Armenia. In a span of 6 months, some 180,000 people lost their lives due to malnutrition and disease. Eyewitnesses remarked that there were not enough wagons to carry the dead to the graveyards. Yet there was a will to survive and triumph. There was hope towards the dawn of a new day that was going to come. This faith was also followed through by the prudent actions of the Armenian government. In a land full of hunger and disease, the government opened new schools, and hardly a year had passed since the establishment of the Republic when a decision was made to open the new University of Armenia. The last Armenian university was destroyed by foreign invaders in the 16th century. In 1919, after 4 centuries of absence in Armenia, a new university was established. The University of Armenia first opened its doors in Gyumri, and in 1920 permanently moved to Yerevan. Since all of the major institutions of the Armenian state were practically destroyed during 6 centuries of foreign occupation, everything had to be carried out from scratch. A parliamentary republic with all its accompanying institutions centered in Yerevan was painstakingly created. On May 28, 1919, on the first anniversary of Armenian independence, Armenia was proclaimed as free and united. The declaration proclaimed, "In order to restore the wholeness of Armenia and secure the complete freedom and prosperity of the people, the government of Armenia, according to the unanimous wish and the will of the Armenian people, declares that from henceforth the divided parts of Armenia are permanently reunited as an independent state." Thus, in May of 1919, Yerevan was proclaimed as the capital of the free, independent, and united Armenia, which declared the union of Eastern and Western Armenias. According to the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, and subsequently according to the Treaty of Sèvres and the arbitrary award of the United States President Woodrow Wilson, the Republic of Armenia included within its boundaries 4 out of the 7 provinces of Western Armenia. According to this arrangement, Yerevan was to become the capital of united Armenia. However, the Kemalist Turkish nationalists joined hands with Bolsheviks of Russia and in September of 1920 invaded Armenia. On December 2, 1920, these two unrecognized entities occupied and divided Armenia into 2 halves. The province of Kars and the county of Surmalu were illegally occupied by Turkey. The Armenian provinces of Karabakh and Nakhichevan were handed by the Soviets to neighboring Azerbaijan. The Armenian province of Javak was given to Georgia, and the rest of the territory of the Republic of Armenia was proclaimed as Soviet Armenia. From the 60,000 square kilometers of the Republic of Armenia, Soviet Armenia was left with only 30,000 square kilometers. The capital of Soviet Armenia remained in Yerevan. The Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic within the USSR was a semi-independent state in which the development of national culture was initially not encouraged. Besides the destruction of the churches of Saints Peter and Paul in Katogike, the Soviet authorities in the 1930s also destroyed the Church of St. Gregory the Illuminator, Church of Gethsemane, St. Simon Seruni, and Church of Melaire, along with the medieval cemetery of Kozern and other historic structures. The Russian Orthodox Church of St. Nicholas was built in the 19th century, was also demolished by the Soviets. The Russian Orthodox Church of the Holy Mother of God, erected in 1913, was converted into a movie theater and was only restored as a church in 1991, after Armenia once again became independent. Throughout the 1930s, many leading Armenian intellectuals were killed by Stalin's henchmen. In 1938, the remains of the fortress of Yerevan were demolished and a wine factory was built in its place. The fortress of Yerevan, which had withstood many calamities throughout its history, is today obliterated. We can only imagine how it must have looked like by looking at the old photographs and miniature models of the fortress. Along with the fortress walls, the Khan's palace, which was a fine example of Islamic architecture, were also destroyed by the Soviet authorities. The only surviving monument which reminds us of the Persian rule is represented by the 18th century Blue Mosque, which is located in the center of Yerevan. Nevertheless, contrary to the policies which led to the occupation of Armenia's territory, destruction of its spiritual and cultural monuments, exile of its leading intellectuals, and loss of hundreds of thousands of Armenians in various wars. The creative spirit of the Armenian people, within the boundaries of relatively stable conditions created during the Soviet rule, was able to quickly recover and rebuild. Just like the heroes of the Armenian national epic, Yerevan was growing and expanding not year by year, but hour by hour. In 1924, the indigenous architect Alexander Tamanian laid out the new general plan of the city of Yerevan. In 1926, the construction of the new city began with the completion of the main square of the city. Later on, in the northern section of the square, the building of the History Museum of Armenia was also completed. The building of the Armenian National Academic Theater of Opera and Ballet was also built, along with the Armenia's first modern astronomical observatory. The Armenians from Armenia, as well as the diaspora in massive numbers, participated in World War II. In Yerevan, the 89th, 408th, and 261st Armenian Infantry Divisions were formed. The 89th Division reached Berlin. The 408th helped to liberate Czechoslovakia, while the 261st Division remained on the Armenia-Turkey border, since Turkey, although claiming to be neutral, was actually in a secret alliance with Nazi Germany, and the 261st Division remained to defend Armenia from a possible Turkish aggression. Many of Yerevan's residents did not return from the war, and many who did came back with the highest decorations and awards. After the war, a new construction boom took place in Yerevan and in Armenia in general. In 1945, the Victory Bridge going across the Harazdin River was completed. Years later, another massive bridge was added to the city's landscape. These new structures enriched Yerevan and made the city even more attractive. To mark victory in the Second World War, a new park named Victory Park was created. The central theme of the park features the monument Mother Armenia, which was erected in 1967. Not far from the statue stands a 50-meter-tall obelisk, which at its apex features the Tree of Life, the symbol of immortality. In the 1950s, after the death of Stalin, certain favorable conditions developed which enabled the enrichment of Armenian culture. In 1957, the Mesrop Mashtats Institute Museum of Ancient Manuscripts, or the Mate Nadaran, was established. The Museum Institute became the largest depository of ancient Armenian manuscripts. In 1959, the statue of Sasunsi David, the main hero of the Armenian national epic, the Daredevils of Sasun, was unveiled in Yerevan. In 1965, the 50th anniversary of the Armenian genocide was marked in Yerevan and throughout Armenia. In 1967, the Armenian Genocide Memorial was completed in Yerevan. In 1968, Yerevan marked the 2,750th anniversary of its founding, and from henceforth, the annual celebration held in October became a tradition. The creation of new housing throughout the city led to a large boom in the city's population. Yerevan quickly became a city of 500,000, and only 2 decades later, 1 million residents.
Խորհրդային տարիներին զանգվածային բնակարանաշինության քաղաքականություն է իրականացում Երևանում, որը hենց կապված էր արդյունաբերության։
The rapid expansion of apartment buildings throughout Yerevan was part of the growing industry of the city. A number of outlying villages in the second half of the 20th century were absorbed by Greater Yerevan. The city's periphery expanded. The population growth rate during this time was also relatively high. In addition, many inhabitants of the towns and villages throughout Armenia also migrated to Yerevan. A number of Armenians from the diaspora throughout the 1940s and 1960s also repatriated to Armenia, and many of them settled in Yerevan. All of these factors led to the rapid growth of the city's population. The 1926 census recorded Yerevan's population at approximately 67,000, while the 1959 census gave the number of city's residents at more than 500,000. Only 20 years later, the 1979 census of Yerevan recorded the number of city's inhabitants at more than 1 million. By this time, Yerevan had become one of the most important industrial centers of the USSR. The construction boom continued in the 1980s. During this time, the Yerevan city subway and the sports and music complex were built. Numerous cultural and scientific centers, along with new theaters and museums, were established. In 1991, as the USSR was on the verge of collapse, 38% of the inhabitants of Soviet Armenia lived in Yerevan. This was a sharp contrast to the first Soviet census of 1926, which recorded that only 7% of Soviet Armenia's population was concentrated in Yerevan. Among the 15 constituent Soviet republics and their corresponding capitals, Armenia and Yerevan respectively had the most ethnically homogenized population. The Armenias in 1988 were the first among the people of the USSR to raise the flag of national liberation and democracy. The Armenian people rose up in order to defend Artsakh-Karabakh from Azeri aggression and make sure that this Armenian region is once and for all reunited with Armenia. Yerevan became the epicenter of a movement that would eventually topple the Soviet Union. In 1991, Armenia once again became independent, and Yerevan was proclaimed as the capital of a free Armenia. The first years of independence were full of hardships. There was a socio-economic crisis. Armenia was constantly attacked by neighboring Azerbaijan, but the will and the determination of the Armenian people overcame all obstacles. The difficult post-Soviet years also took a heavy toll on the industrial output of the Republic of Armenia, as the country was blockaded from the east and west by Azerbaijan and Turkey. The population of various cities throughout Armenia dwindled. Some of these cities lost 50 to 60% of their population. Yerevan, contrary to many other Armenian towns and cities, did not sustain a large drop in its population. This was mostly due to the fact that many of the inhabitants of Yerevan, who had migrated to other countries, were in turn replaced by Armenians from various towns and villages of Armenia. As a result, Yerevan today remains a city of approximately 1 million inhabitants, and about one-third of Armenia's overall population resides in the capital of Armenia. The population of Yerevan, according to the National Statistical Service of the Republic of Armenia, stands at 1,077,600 persons. This is the number of permanent residents of Yerevan based on the official census of 2011. Yerevan, a great city that is definitely being built and further developed. In the meanwhile, archaeologists continue to unearth new artifacts and find new sites throughout the ever-old and ever-new city, which helps us to better understand some of the unknown parts, Yerevan's past. The earliest traces of our distant ancestors in the environs of Yerevan date back to around 2 million years ago. Nearly 6,000 years ago, Yerevan became an early city center. 2,800 years ago, in the year 782 BC, the fortress city of Erebuni Yerevan was founded. And although for the past half a millennium, the city of Yerevan was an important center of Armenian culture life, it only became the capital of independent Armenia a century ago. Thus, in 2018, we are not only celebrating the 2,800th anniversary of Yerevan, but also the 100th anniversary of Yerevan as the capital of free and independent Armenia. Such is the history of the traveler across millennia. The city of Yerevan has a great past, and more importantly, is today creating a great history and laying the foundations for the brilliant future that is yet to come.